The waves crashed against the shore as I stepped off the small boat, my heart pounding louder than the ocean itself. The island looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, with its tall palms swaying gently in the wind and the golden sand glistening under the sun. My husband, Daniel, had always forbidden me from coming here. "It's dangerous, Emily. Promise me you'll never go there," he used to say, his tone trembling with a fear I never understood. But after his sudden death 3 months ago, I found a small, rusted key hidden inside his favorite watch, wrapped in a torn piece of paper that said only 3 words. "Don't trust anyone." Now I was here, holding that same key in my pocket, determined to uncover what Daniel had been hiding. Every step I took on that island felt like walking deeper into his secrets. His presence lingered everywhere. In the quiet wind, in the half-collapsed cabin by the trees, in the faint smell of his cologne that somehow hadn't faded with time. I thought I knew my husband. We shared laughter, dreams, and a life I believed was built on truth. But as I stood before the locked door of a hidden basement buried under the old cabin, I realized the man I loved had lived a life I never really saw. And when that door creaked open, revealing what he had been protecting all these years, my hands trembled. Because Daniel hadn't died keeping a secret. He had died protecting it. The house had never felt so empty. Every sound echoed through the walls, the ticking of the clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the wooden floor under my trembling feet. 3 months had passed since Daniel's death, yet it still didn't feel real. I kept expecting to hear the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway, the door opening, his voice calling my name with that warm laugh that could melt any bad day. But all I heard now was silence, a silence that pressed against my chest until breathing felt like work. People said time would heal, that grief fades like a bruise. But whoever said that had never lost someone whose absence felt like the unraveling of an entire life. I couldn't sleep. Nights were the worst, filled with his voice in my head, his words looping endlessly. "Promise me, Emily. Never go to that island." He used to say it whenever the topic came up, even jokingly. I thought it was superstition, some irrational fear, maybe a bad memory from before we met. I never questioned it deeply. Why would I? Marriage, I thought, was built on trust, and Daniel had never given me a reason to doubt him. Until he died. They said it was an accident. His car had gone off a cliff late at night. The police report mentioned slippery roads and brake failure. I wanted to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Daniel was a cautious driver, the kind of man who double-checked locks and reread instruction manuals before using a blender. He didn't drive fast. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He didn't just crash. After the funeral, people came with condolences, friends, co-workers, neighbors. They spoke about him in past tense like it made it easier. He was such a good man. He always had a smile. He'll be missed. But their eyes told a different story. Some avoided meeting mine entirely. His boss, Mr. Grant, didn't even stay long enough to eat the food I'd laid out. He muttered something about unfortunate timing and left. The rest of them followed soon after, leaving me in the ruins of the life I thought I knew. For weeks, I drifted through days like a ghost. The world kept moving. Bills arrived, the garden grew weeds, the phone rang with people asking about his estate. I went through the motions, but inside I was frozen. Until one night everything changed. It was just past midnight. I couldn't sleep, so I found myself wandering into Daniel's study, a small room he'd always kept private. He used to spend hours here, writing reports, making calls, sometimes locking the door when he said he needed focus. I never thought much of it. But that night something pulled me in. Maybe instinct, maybe desperation. The air smelled faintly of his cologne and old paper. His desk was neat, as always, except for a single drawer that was slightly ajar. Pulled it open. Inside were his usual things. Receipts, pens, a few business cards, nothing unusual. But when I ran my fingers along the back edge, something felt uneven. There was a false panel. I pressed gently, and it popped open with a soft click. My heart skipped. Behind it was a small metal box, no bigger than a jewelry case. It was locked, but I knew Daniel's habits. He always kept spare keys hidden in plain sight. Sure enough, tucked under the desk lamp's base, I found a tiny brass key. My hands were shaking as I fitted into the box. It turned with a quiet snap. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper and something wrapped in a handkerchief. I unfolded the paper first. The handwriting was Daniel's, messy, rushed, unlike his usual tidy script. The message was short, just 3 words that made my blood run cold. Don't trust anyone. For a long moment I just stared. What did it mean? Who wasn't I supposed to trust? I unfolded the handkerchief next. Inside was a small, rusted key. Old-fashioned, heavy, the kind that belonged to a door, not a safe or car. I turned it over, noticing faint scratches near the teeth. It looked well used. My mind raced. Daniel didn't own anything that needed a key like this. I remembered the island. It was called Crescent Isle, a small crescent-shaped patch of land about 20 miles off the coast. Daniel had inherited it from his late uncle before we got married. He rarely mentioned it, and whenever I asked if we could visit, he shut the idea down instantly. It's dangerous, he'd say. It's not safe, Emily. Promise me you'll never go there. I always thought he was just being overprotective. But now, with that key in my hand and his warning echoing in my mind, it didn't feel like fear anymore. Felt like a secret. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat at his desk until dawn, staring at the key and note, trying to piece together what he had been hiding. Had someone killed him because of it? Was his death really an accident? Every theory sounded absurd until I remembered the way his colleagues had acted after the funeral. Tense, distant, avoiding my questions. Maybe they knew something. Maybe that's why Daniel had written, "Don't trust anyone." By morning I had made up my mind. I would go to Crescent Isle. The decision terrified me. I'd never traveled alone before, especially not to some remote, half-forgotten island that everyone seemed to avoid. But something inside me, a mix of grief, anger, and love, pushed me forward. I couldn't let his death remain a mystery. Not when the answer might be waiting out there. I spent the next 2 days preparing quietly. I withdrew cash, packed a small bag, and told my sister I was going away for a few days to clear my head. She didn't question it. No one did. They all assumed grief had finally made me restless. In a way, they weren't wrong. On the morning I left, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. I drove to the harbor Daniel used to mention occasionally, a private dock where small ferries operated for local routes. The man at the ticket booth looked at me strangely when I asked about Crescent Isle. "No one goes there anymore," he said, lowering his voice. "You sure that's where you want to go?" "Yes," I said firmly. "My husband owned property there." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Storm's coming in this evening. If you're going, go now. But be careful, ma'am. People say that place brings bad luck." I forced a small smile. I've already had enough bad luck. The ferry was old and creaked with every wave. I sat at the front, gripping my bag tightly, feeling the cold wind whip against my face. As the mainland disappeared behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a line, stepping into a place Daniel had tried so hard to keep me away from. When the island came into view, it was smaller than I expected. Lush, wild, surrounded by jagged rocks and dense forest. There was a small dock and what looked like an old house near the shore. The boatman refused to come closer than a few feet from the sand. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," he said. "If the weather holds." I nodded and stepped off, my shoes sinking into the wet sand. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the sound of waves filled the silence. My heart raced as I looked around. The place was beautiful, hauntingly so, like a secret the world had forgotten. As I walked toward the old house, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying faint whispers that sounded almost like my name. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the window, a shadow passing quickly. But when I reached the porch, the door stood open, creaking softly in the wind. And just like that I knew, this island wasn't abandoned. Someone had been here before me. And maybe, just maybe, they were still here. The air was heavy with salt and silence as I stood before the open door. The house loomed tall and crooked against the gray sky, its wooden walls weathered and scarred by years of wind and sea. It looked as though it had been waiting for me, or for the truth I was about to uncover. I hesitated on the porch, my fingers brushing against the rusted handle. The wood was damp and cold. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to cross the threshold. My heart pounded like it wanted to warn me. But then I remembered Daniel's note, "Don't trust anyone," and the key that had led me here. I had come too far to turn back. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old paper, and something faintly familiar, the scent of Daniel's cologne lingering like a ghost. The living room was small but tidy, the kind of place someone had once loved but hadn't touched in years. A faded couch sat against the wall, and a coffee table was stacked with yellowed magazines. There was an old clock ticking faintly on the mantel, even though there was no sign of power. I ran my fingers along the furniture, leaving streaks through the dust. Every inch of the room felt like a whisper from the past. I called his name softly. "Daniel!" Half hoping, half dreading an answer. Only the echo of my voice came back. Still, something about the space made me feel watched, as if the walls themselves carried secrets. I explored cautiously, moving from room to room. The kitchen was small, its cupboards empty, though there were a few cans on the counter, newer than the rest of the items in the house. Someone had been here recently. That realization sent a chill crawling up my spine. The door at the back of the kitchen led to a narrow hallway. I followed it, noticing footprints faintly pressed into the dust on the floor. Boot prints, large, definitely not mine. I stopped at the end of the hallway, where a small study stood half-lit by a grimy window. Papers were scattered across the desk, some damp and curling at the edges. My breath caught when I recognized the handwriting. Daniel's. His neat script, the same loops and slants I'd seen on grocery lists and love notes. My hands shook as I lifted one of the pages. It was a report, dated nearly 6 months before his death. Words jumped out at me. Shipment, offshore accounts, illegal transfers, evidence. I didn't understand all of it, but one line at the bottom made my blood run cold. Crescent Isle is the key. Keep everything hidden until it's safe. My eyes darted to the corner of the room where an old rug covered part of the floor. Something about the way it was laid, uneven and slightly raised, caught my attention. I pulled it back, revealing a wooden trapdoor with a heavy metal lock. I crouched down and felt for the key in my pocket, the same one I'd found in Daniel's desk. My heart pounded as I fitted into the lock. It turned easily, as though it had been waiting for me. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of cool, damp air from below. I shone my flashlight into the darkness and saw a narrow staircase leading down into what looked like a basement. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed to go back, to leave this place and pretend I never found it. But I couldn't. I needed to know what Daniel had been hiding, what had scared him enough to keep me away. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step. My flashlight beam swept across stone walls lined with wooden shelves. Boxes, files, and metal crates filled the small room. It looked more like an archive than a basement. I moved toward one of the crates and pried it open. Inside were sealed envelopes and USB drives labeled with dates and names. I opened one folder at random and froze. It was full of photos. Daniel standing with men I didn't recognize on this very island. In some of the photos he looked tense, almost frightened. Others showed shipping containers, weapons, and unfamiliar faces exchanging briefcases. There were also documents bearing the logo of the company he worked for, Horizon Industries. I remembered the name from his business cards. But what were they doing on this island? Kept reading. The files mentioned offshore accounts, illegal shipments, and payments routed through dummy corporations. The deeper I went, the more horrifying it became. My husband hadn't been just an employee. He had been investigating the company he worked for. It wasn't an island for vacation or inheritance. It was a front, a hidden base for smuggling operations. Daniel had found out. And now he was dead. The flashlight flickered, and for a second, the darkness swallowed me whole. When it steadied again, I felt a rush of panic. The air around me had changed. It wasn't just still, it was charged, heavy like the moment before a storm. I heard something above. A faint creak, a slow step across the floorboards. Someone was upstairs. I froze, holding my breath. Another step. Then another. I turned off the flashlight, standing perfectly still in the dark. My pulse pounded in my ears so loudly I was sure whoever it was could hear it. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of the front door creaking open again. And closing. I waited a full minute before daring to move. My hands trembled as I climbed the stairs, each step a battle between fear and urgency. The house was silent again when I emerged, but something was different. A chair had been moved. The door I'd left half open was now fully shut. Whoever had been here knew I was inside. I wanted to run, to get off that island and never look back, but I couldn't leave without taking proof of what I'd found. I hurried back to the study, grabbing as many files and drives as I could fit into my bag. Then I stopped. On the edge of the desk, written in Daniel's handwriting, was a single sentence scrawled on the corner of an old map. If I don't make it back, trust the light. I stared at it, confused. The map showed the outline of Crescent Isle, with several markings, one near the forest, another by the cliffs. A small red X had been drawn near what looked like a tower symbol. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my bag. Whatever the light meant, I had a feeling it was important. The rain started soon after. Thunder rolled across the sea, echoing through the trees. I peered out the window and saw shadows moving near the dock. 2 figures, flashlights cutting through the mist. My heart leapt into my throat. They were looking for someone. Me. I blew out the candle I'd lit earlier and crouched by the window. The men moved closer, their voices low but urgent. I couldn't hear the words, but I caught one phrase clearly. She's here. I didn't think, I just ran. I slipped out the back door, clutching my bag, and darted into the forest. Branches scratched my face as I pushed through the darkness, guided only by the faint glow of my flashlight, which I kept low to avoid being seen. Behind me, I heard shouting, footsteps crunching through the underbrush. The storm broke overhead, rain pouring down in sheets, turning the ground slick and treacherous. I stumbled, fell, and caught myself on a tree. My lungs burned, my heart hammering like a drum. But I kept going until the lights behind me faded. When I finally stopped, drenched and shivering, I realized I was standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. Below, lightning illuminated a structure built into the rocks. An old lighthouse, half collapsed but still standing tall against the waves. And in that brief flash of light, I saw something glimmer near its base. Something metallic, reflecting the storm. Daniel's words echoed in my head. Trust the light. That's when I knew, whatever he had hidden, whatever truth he had died for, it was waiting for me there, in the lighthouse at the edge of the island. The storm raged like an unending scream from the sea. Lightning carved brief flashes of white across the sky, and the roar of thunder rolled through the cliffs as I made my way down the narrow rocky path toward the lighthouse. My clothes were soaked, clinging to my skin, and every step felt heavier than the last. I had no idea what time it was. The world around me existed only in darkness and noise. But I knew I couldn't stop. Daniel's words kept echoing in my mind like a heartbeat I couldn't silence. If I don't make it back, trust the light. The lighthouse loomed ahead, tall and broken, its once white walls streaked with mold and time. The top light hadn't worked in years, its glass shattered, its metal frame rusted by the ocean's breath. It looked abandoned, just like everything else on this cursed island. But something about it pulled me closer. A strange familiarity, a quiet certainty that this was where the truth waited. The wind whipped my hair into my face as I reached the base. The door was half off its hinges, groaning with each gust of wind. I pushed it open, stepping into the damp, hollow interior. The smell hit me first, a mix of salt, rust, and rot. My flashlight flickered across the room, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward and another door leading down into darkness. The walls were covered in peeling paint, but faint markings were visible beneath. Handprints, smudges, and what looked like faint letters scratched into the plaster. I leaned closer and realized they were numbers. Coordinates. My pulse quickened. Daniel had written coordinates on the lighthouse wall. I took a photo with my phone, my fingers trembling. Then I turned toward the lower door. The air seeping from below was colder, denser, and it carried an odd metallic scent. I hesitated, remembering the footsteps I'd heard back at the house, the men searching for me. If they realized I'd escaped, they'd be back. Maybe already were. But I had come this far. If Daniel's secret was down there, I needed to see it before anyone else could take it away again. I opened the door and descended slowly, one hand on the wet railing, the other gripping my flashlight. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. At the bottom was a small chamber, dim and silent except for the steady dripping of water from the ceiling. There was a generator in one corner, ancient, covered in dust, and beside it a metal cabinet. On the wall hung a single framed photograph. It was of Daniel. He stood in front of this very lighthouse, his smile faint but real. He looked younger, maybe a few years before I met him. But behind that smile I could see it now, something guarded in his eyes, something he'd been hiding even then. My throat tightened. I turned my attention to the cabinet. The lock was rusted, but after a few tugs it gave way. Inside were papers sealed in plastic and a small metal box, similar to the one I'd found in his study back home. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were memory cards, a few folded letters, and a single USB drive labeled Horizon Files. Final. The generator sputtered suddenly, as if something had stirred inside it. My heart leapt. I stepped back, clutching the drive. When the noise settled again, I forced myself to breathe. The letters inside the box were addressed to me. The first one began, "Emily, if you're reading this, I'm already gone." My vision blurred as I read. His handwriting was clear and deliberate, the tone heavy but calm, like a man who had accepted his fate long before it reached him. He wrote about the company Horizon Industries, and how he'd discovered that they were running illegal arms deals through offshore accounts hidden under humanitarian projects. The island had been one of their drop points, disguised as research property. When he found out, he started collecting evidence, but someone inside the company noticed. "I couldn't tell you," the letter said. "I wanted to protect you. They were watching everything, our phones, our house, even the mail. If anything happens to me, don't go to the police. Don't trust my colleagues. Some of them are part of it. You'll know who's telling the truth when you find the light." I pressed the paper to my chest, tears mixing with rainwater still dripping from my hair. He had known. He had known he wouldn't survive. But he still fought, still gathered everything he could to make sure the truth wouldn't die with him. I slipped the USB drive into my pocket, along with the letters. I needed to get off this island now. But as I turned toward the stairs, I froze. Voices. They were faint but unmistakable, muffled by the storm but drawing closer. Two men, the same ones from before. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind the generator, my breath shallow. Their footsteps echoed above, then started descending. I could see their shadows flickering against the wall. "She's got the files," one said, his voice sharp and impatient. "I saw her bag." "How the hell did she find this place?" the other muttered. "I told Grant we should have burned everything after Daniel died." Hearing his name from their mouths made me feel sick. So it was true. Daniel's own boss had been involved. The man who'd offered empty condolences at his funeral had been part of the reason he was gone. My fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. The men moved around the room, searching. One of them kicked over a crate. "Nothing here," he grumbled. "Maybe she's already dead." I waited until they turned their backs, then crept silently toward the stairs. My foot brushed against a loose stone, and it shifted with a small clink. The sound was soft, but it was enough. "Wait!" one of them shouted. Ran. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning as they shouted behind me. I burst out into the storm, the wind slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't look back, I couldn't. Lightning split the sky, showing me flashes of the path ahead. The mud was slick, the rocks sharp, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I reached the cliff edge, the sea raging below, and looked around desperately for cover. That's when I saw it. A small shed near the base of the lighthouse, half buried under vines and rubble. I stumbled toward it and slipped inside, closing the door just as the men's voices grew louder again. Inside was darkness, and the faint hum of something electric. I turned my flashlight on low, scanning the room. It wasn't a shed. It was a control room, or what used to be one. Old panels lined the walls, filled with switches and dead monitors. And in the center, under a broken skylight, was a single power console. I remembered Daniel's words again. Trust the light. My eyes darted to the lever marked main beam power. I hesitated for only a second before pulling it down. The sound was deafening, a groan, then a low hum as electricity surged through the old structure. The lighthouse shuddered, and after a few heartbeats, a beam of light cut through the storm. Bright, blinding, alive. It shot out across the sea, slicing through the fog. The men's shouts stopped. Then I heard them curse. They had seen it. The light revealed everything. The path, the boats, even the figures below scrambling on the beach. But as I looked closer, I saw something else. Another boat, far out in the distance, approaching fast. It wasn't one of theirs. Someone had seen the light. Maybe Daniel had arranged it long ago. Maybe this was his final plan. His way to make sure the truth didn't die. The storm raged on, but hope flickered inside me. I clutched the USB drive, knowing that whatever happened next, I had something powerful, something worth more than my fear. Outside, I could hear the men getting closer again, shouting over the wind. I took one last look at the glowing beam slicing through the darkness, whispering, "I found it, Daniel." I trusted the light. Then I ran toward the cliffs, toward the incoming boat, praying that whoever was out there was friend, not enemy, and that I could escape before the storm or the men swallowed me whole. The light from the lighthouse carved through the storm like a blade, a beacon against the chaos that surrounded the island. I stumbled through the rain, half blinded by wind and fear, my boots slipping in the mud as the beam swept over the cliffs and sea. My heart was racing so violently that I could hear the blood in my ears louder than the thunder. Somewhere behind me, the men were shouting, angry, desperate voices cutting through the howling wind. They were getting closer. The boat I'd seen in the distance was moving fast now, its silhouette growing clearer with every flash of lightning. It was small, maybe meant for fishing or rescue, but I couldn't tell who was inside. All I knew was that it was my only chance. If I didn't reach it before those men did, everything Daniel had died for, everything I had risked to uncover, would be lost. I ducked behind a large boulder, gasping for air. My fingers clutched the USB drive in my pocket as if it were life itself. I could feel the edges digging into my palm, grounding me in this nightmare. The men's voices were closer now, one shouting over the storm, the other swearing under his breath. I pressed my back against the cold rock and peeked around the edge. Two of them were there, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One was tall, bald, wearing a black raincoat. The other, shorter, carried a gun. Their lights swept across the cliffs, coming dangerously close to where I hid. My breath caught in my throat. "Check the beach," the taller one barked. "She's got nowhere else to go. The boss wants that drive back tonight." The other man nodded and moved toward the edge. I waited until they were a few feet away, then slipped silently out from behind the boulder, crouching low and running toward the tree line. The rain masked the sound of my steps, but the mud slowed me down. I nearly fell twice, catching myself on branches and rocks. Every part of me ached, but fear kept me moving. When I finally reached the slope leading down to the beach, I paused to catch my breath. The light from the lighthouse illuminated the path just enough for me to see the narrow trail that led down to the dock. The boat was closer now. I could hear the engine cutting through the storm. Someone was shouting over the wind, though I couldn't make out the words. Then behind me a gunshot cracked through the air. The sound exploded in my ears. The bullet hit a rock near my feet, spraying fragments of stone into the mud. I screamed and dove behind a tree. The men were running toward me now, flashlights bouncing wildly. "She's here," one yelled. I scrambled down the slope, sliding and falling, branches tearing at my clothes. Another shot rang out, closer this time, the sound echoing off the cliffs. The boat's horn blared once, a warning or a signal, I didn't know. I hit the sand hard, my knees sinking deep. The wind was howling, waves crashing furiously against the shore. I waved frantically at the boat. A figure appeared on deck, holding a flashlight. "Emily!" a voice shouted, a man's voice, rough but familiar. "Get in, quick!" I hesitated. My heart leapt with recognition. The voice belonged to someone I hadn't heard in months. Detective Harris, Daniel's old friend from the city police. He had come to the funeral, offered condolences, and disappeared after the case was closed. I'd almost forgotten him. What was he doing here? "Move!" he shouted again, motioning me forward. Ran. The waves crashed against my legs, drenching me as I waded toward the boat. Harris leaned over the side, extending his arm. Just as I reached for it, another shot fired. The water splashed near my hand, and I ducked instinctively. Harris grabbed my wrist and pulled me aboard, dragging me onto the wet deck. "Go!" he yelled to the man steering the boat. The engine roared to life, cutting through the storm as we pulled away from the shore. I turned just in time to see the two men on the beach, one firing into the water, the other shouting into a radio. The lighthouse beam swung over them once more before vanishing into the fog. For a long moment, the only sounds were the engine and the storm. My body trembled uncontrollably, my heart still racing. Harris knelt beside me, soaked and breathless. His face was harder than I remembered, older, wearier, but his eyes still carried that same quiet steadiness. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low but firm. "You knew." I gasped, clutching the edge of the boat for balance. "You knew about the island." He hesitated, glancing toward the other man piloting the boat. Then he nodded. "Daniel told me before he died." I didn't believe him at first. It sounded too big, too dangerous. But when I heard what happened to him, I started digging. "When you disappeared, I figured you'd go where he didn't want you to." My stomach twisted. "Why didn't you warn me?" "They tried to kill me, Harris. They were here, they knew I'd come." "I couldn't," he said quietly. "I didn't know who was watching. Horizon had people everywhere, even in law enforcement. I had to move carefully." He looked at me sharply. "You found it, didn't you? The evidence." I reached into my pocket and held up the USB drive. "He left everything on this." Harris exhaled, relief flashing across his face. "Then we have them. We can finally finish what he started." But something about his tone unsettled me. It was too controlled, too practiced, like he had rehearsed those words. I stared at him, searching for a trace of the man who had comforted me at Daniel's funeral, who had promised to find the truth. But the storm light revealed something colder in his eyes. "You're working with them, aren't you?" I whispered. He froze. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. Then slowly he smiled. "You're smarter than he gave you credit for." My chest tightened. I stumbled backward, gripping the side of the boat. "You killed him," I said. "You were his friend, and you killed him." Harris shook his head, almost pitying. "I didn't have a choice. Daniel got too close. He was going to expose everyone, the company, the investors, the people funding it. Do you think they'd let him just walk away?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "And now you're doing the same thing." Before I could react, he lunged. I twisted away, but he grabbed my arm, yanking the USB from my hand. I screamed, struggling against his grip. The boat rocked violently, the waves crashing harder. The other man at the wheel turned, shouting something, but before he could move, Lightning struck the sea nearby, lighting the world in blinding white. The shock threw us both off balance. I slammed my elbow into Harris's ribs, and he stumbled. The drive flew from his hand, sliding across the wet deck. I dove for it, but he recovered quickly, pulling a knife from his coat. His face was a mask of rage. "You could have just stayed home," he hissed. "You could have left the past buried." I didn't think, I just acted. I kicked at his leg, sending him crashing into the railing. The boat lurched violently as another wave hit. Harris lost his grip for a split second, and then the railing snapped. His eyes widened in shock as he fell backward into the Black Sea. I screamed his name once, but the storm swallowed it whole. He disappeared beneath the waves, gone without a trace. The other man, the pilot, stared at me wide-eyed. "What the hell happened?" he shouted over the wind. "Keep going," he yelled back. "Get us off this island." He hesitated, then turned the wheel, guiding the boat toward the distant lights of the mainland. I sank to my knees, drenched, trembling, clutching the USB drive against my chest. Harris was gone. The men on the island were behind us. But the truth, the dangerous, burning truth, was still in my hands. As the storm began to fade, I looked back one last time. The lighthouse stood like a ghost in the distance, its beam flickering weakly across the dark water. I thought of Daniel, of his warnings, his courage, his sacrifice. He had trusted me to find the light, to finish what he couldn't. And now, finally, I was ready to bring everything into the open, no matter what it cost. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Harris might have died, but the people behind him, the real power, were still out there, watching, waiting. And as I clutched the drive tighter, feeling the hum of the boat beneath me, I made a silent promise to Daniel. "They took everything from you. I'll make sure they pay for it." We reached the mainland at dawn, the storm finally tiring and the sky opening to a pale, washed-out light that felt almost gentle after the violence of the night. The pilot tied the boat to the dock with hands that trembled only a little, and for a moment I stood there on the wet planks, the USB drive heavy in my pocket like a heart. I wanted to fall apart, to let every tear I had been holding back for weeks finally spill out, but there was no time for that kind of private grief yet. The world needed what was on that little piece of technology, and Daniel had trusted me to make sure it mattered. We went straight to the cafe near the harbor where I had arranged to meet a journalist Daniel once mentioned in a passing compliment. Maya Patel, a woman with quick eyes and a reputation for not letting stories die. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a single long rush. The key, the island, the files, the lighthouse, Harris, the men on the beach. She did not flinch when I described the look on Harris's face as he lunged for the drive, and when I handed it over to her, she treated it with the gravity of someone who understood that paper and pixels could kill or save people. Maya plugged the drive into her laptop and sat with it for a long time, reading each file, watching each forced smile and cold handshake and ledger entry reveal a network that reached far beyond Horizon Industries. Shell companies, corrupt officials, off-the-books investors, shipments logged as medical supplies but actually containing crates of weapons. She didn't call me that day. Instead she left, promising to do the quiet, dangerous work of verifying sources and securing backups. She told me to go home and sleep, but sleep would come later if it came at all. In the first week, everything moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted. Maya's article went live with careful language and undeniable documents attached. The headline was measured but damning, and within 24 hours it was picked up by larger outlets. People began to call, other journalists, a lawyer who said he could help me file a civil suit, an investigator from a federal agency who sounded exhausted but determined. Daniel's colleagues were subpoenaed, and Horizon's stock dipped as investors panicked and the board called emergency meetings. Some people were careful with their words. Others were not. Mr. Grant, Daniel's boss, gave a public statement that said nothing and everything, and the private messages he had sent to associates were leaked in an exposé that made him hard to defend. Arrests followed. Middle managers first, then the men who had been on Crescent Isle, and finally a handful of executives whose names had appeared in the ledgers. The trial that followed was messy and ugly and necessary, full of lawyers in suits and camera flashes and the kind of moral arguments that scarred me in a way the storm on the island never could. I testified, of course, and the courtroom felt like a place made of glass where everyone could see the worst parts of me and also the parts that had been brave enough to stand up. I told the jury about the key, the lighthouse, Harris falling into the sea. I said Daniel's name so many times the sound of it felt like a prayer and a verdict. Some of the guilty were convicted. Others made deals. A few vanished into the kinds of loopholes the courtroom could not reach. Justice arrived imperfect and uneven, but it arrived, and that mattered more than any clean ending I had hoped for. During the months after the trial, I learned to live with a new normal. People who had once kept their distance came to the house with casseroles and apologies. Some of them were too late to be comfortable, but grief rewires people in strange ways, and I accepted what kindness I could find. Maya and I became friends in a slow, practical way. She would call in the middle of the night if another leak surfaced, and I would answer because she had shown me how truth could be a shield as well as a weapon. I worked with the investigator to secure the evidence we had salvaged from the island, and together we handed it over to authorities in a way that made it harder for anyone powerful to bury it again. There were threats, of course. Anonymous calls, a car that followed me one afternoon and then disappeared when I slowed down at a light, the sensible fear that the people who had once controlled my husband's life were not entirely finished with him or me. But the net was closing. Those who had gotten their hands dirty were no longer anonymous, and the names printed in court documents felt like bindings being nailed down one by one. Still, the thing that kept me up at night wasn't the courtroom or the calls or the occasional shadow at my gate. It was the small, quiet moments when I caught myself reaching for Daniel's hand out of habit and finding the bed empty, when I stood in the kitchen and realized I had no one to argue with about something as trivial as pasta. Grief was a slow companion. It did not leave, but it changed shape, sometimes small and sharp like the pinch of a sting, sometimes wide and dull like an ache behind the ribs. When enough days had gone by to let courage and sorrow sit side by side, I wrote a letter to Daniel and folded it into the little metal box that had first led me to Crescent Isle. I drove back to the harbor because that was the last place I had seen him, and then on a morning when the sun was warm and honest, I took the ferry for the last time. The island had changed a little since the storm. The lighthouse was patched in parts and guarded by men in uniforms that smelled less sinister and more official, and the house was cordoned off with tape. The investigators had done their work here. They had taken samples and photos and catalogued everything that mattered. There was no one left to argue with on the beach. When the ferry left me at the dock, the pilot waved and then pulled away, and I walked slowly toward the lighthouse, the memory of chasing light in the dark like a small animal in my chest. I carried the metal box and the letter and the rusted key in separate pockets, so that each felt like a weight that needed putting down. At the lighthouse I found a bench worn by time and sat until the sun dipped low and painted the water gold. I opened the box and read my letter aloud, though the island did not need to hear it. I needed to say the words to myself. Thank you, I forgive you, I will not let this go. I scattered a handful of Daniel's ashes into the wind and watched as the sea took them gently, as if it had been waiting for that final courtesy. I left the rest of his things, the watch, the folded notes, in a small burial under the roots of a twisted pine that leaned out toward the water. It felt right to let the island hold what it had claimed and to give back what I could. The last thing I did before I left was to stand under the broken glass of the lighthouse and whisper one more thing into the bright air. We did it. I had found the secret. I had carried it out of darkness, and even though the cost had been too high, it had not been in vain. The beam that Daniel had asked me to trust had not only guided a boat, it had exposed a lie big enough to hurt many people and small enough to be held in a hand. As the ferry carried me back to the mainland and the lights of the island blinked behind me like a promise, I felt something shift inside, a softness that was not peace so much as the possibility of peace. I would never stop missing him, and some nights the hurt would still flood back with the tide, but the truth we had found had a way of steadying the world. In the years that followed, when I told the story, I did not make myself a hero. I told it honestly, with the parts about fear and mistakes and the people I had loved and lost. The headlines faded, life settled, and the house stopped echoing quite so loudly. I planted a small garden where weeds once grew and learned that little things, a cup of coffee, a postcard from a friend, could be the bright stitches that mended a life. And sometimes on a clear night, I would look toward the sea and see, far in the distance, a small steady light that warned ships and, for me, kept memory from drowning in the dark. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Subscribe to Twisted Fate Chronicle for more gripping tales of mystery, secrets, and shocking twists.